Mark had lived in his quiet suburban neighborhood for nearly a decade. As the elected president of the HOA, he had always strived to keep things fair, ensuring that the rules weren't used as weapons but as guidelines to maintain the community's harmony. However, there was one person who seemed to believe that the HOA existed for her personal power trip, Karen. Karen wasn't just any HOA board member. She was the kind of person who patrolled the neighborhood with a clipboard and a sense of entitlement so massive it could be seen from space. For years, she had terrorized homeowners with excessive fines, passive-aggressive notes, and threats of action over the smallest violations. Whether it was a flower pot in the wrong shade of beige or a trash can left out 3 minutes past collection time, Karen made sure everyone paid, literally. So when Mark received a notice stating he had been fined $79 for an unspecified violation, he knew something was up. At first, he thought it was a simple clerical mistake. He was the HOA president. After all, why would he be fined? But when he called to ask about it, he was met with Karen's signature, condescending tone. "Oh, Mark, you should really know better. HOA rules apply to everyone. Even you," she purred over the phone. Mark frowned. He hadn't broken any rules. "And what exactly is this fine for?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "Violation 32B, she replied smugly. "Which is?" Karen sighed dramatically, as if he was wasting her valuable time. "You left your car parked in your driveway overnight. You know overnight parking is restricted on visible driveways." Mark almost laughed. The rule was only meant for visitors, not homeowners, and Karen knew it. "That's not how the rule works, Karen. It applies to guest vehicles, not registered residents." "Well, I interpreted it differently," she snapped. "Pay the fine, Mark. Rules are rules." Mark took a slow breath. This was a power move. Karen wasn't just fining him, she was testing him, seeing if she could intimidate even the HOA president into submission. And if he caved, she'd have free rein to bully everyone else without fear of pushback. But Mark wasn't about to roll over. "I won't be paying that fine," he said calmly. Karen let out a mocking laugh. "Oh, I know you will. One way or another, you will comply." Mark had no idea how far Karen was willing to take things, but he was about to find out. The next morning, Mark stepped outside with his coffee, ready to head to work, only to freeze mid-step. 3 bright orange traffic cones sat at the edge of his driveway, and a thick steel chain stretched between them, blocking his car in. A laminated sign dangled from the middle of the chain. "No vehicle access until HOA fine is paid in full." Mark blinked. Did she really just block his own driveway? Karen, standing across the street with her arms folded smugly, gave him a satisfied little wave. "Morning, Mark. Guess you saw the notice," she called out in that fake cheerful tone of hers. Mark felt his jaw clench. This was beyond petty. "You can't block my driveway, Karen. That's illegal." "Oh, but I can," she said sweetly. According to HOA Bylaw 14C, the HOA has the right to place temporary barriers in front of properties in violation of HOA rules until fines are settled. It's all in the paperwork, dear. Mark knew that bylaw. It was meant for serious violations like unpaid fees in the thousands, not some bogus $79 fine. This wasn't enforcement. This was personal. "Move the chain, Karen." "Oh, I'd love to, Mark. But until I see that payment come through, my hands are tied." A few of the neighbors had started peeking out their windows, watching the scene unfold. Some looked amused, others concerned. Karen loved an audience. It made her feel powerful. Mark let out a slow breath. Fine. If she wanted to play dirty, so be it. He pulled out his phone, snapped a picture of the blockade, and called the city code enforcement office. "Hi, yes. I'd like to report an illegal obstruction of a private driveway." Karen's smug expression faltered. She had no idea who she was messing with. Karen's smug smile wavered as Mark spoke into his phone. She clearly hadn't expected him to escalate things so quickly. "Oh, come on, Mark," she scoffed. "You're really calling the city over this? It's just a simple HOA matter." Mark held up a finger, signaling her to wait. "Yes," he said into the phone. "The obstruction is on my private driveway. It's a steel chain, installed without my permission, blocking my vehicle. Yes, I have photo evidence. And it was placed by an HOA member without proper legal authority." Karen's face twitched at that last part. Mark could hear the immediate interest in the city officer's voice. "That is absolutely illegal, sir. the officer said firmly. I'll send an enforcement officer out immediately. Do you know who placed the blockade? Mark looked right at Karen. Oh, I do. Her name's Karen, and she's about to have a very bad day. Karen's arms tightened across her chest as she scoffed. Oh, please, Mark. The city isn't going to waste their time on something like this. You're just embarrassing yourself. But then, a white city enforcement truck turned onto the street. Karen's smirk vanished. Mark leaned against his mailbox, sipping his coffee, enjoying the show. The officer, a tall, no-nonsense woman in sunglasses, stepped out of the truck, clipboard in hand. She took one look at the chain and the smug Karen standing beside it and sighed. All right, what's going on here? Mark handed her his phone with the pictures. HOA member placed an illegal obstruction on my driveway over a bogus fine. She's refusing to remove it. The officer's eyes narrowed as she turned to Karen. Ma'am, do you have legal authorization from the city to block a homeowner's driveway? Karen huffed. I don't need the city's authorization. This is an HOA matter. Our bylaws clearly state, Ma'am, the officer cut her off. HOA bylaws do not override city laws. You're violating Code 11 to 46, obstruction of private property access. That's a direct infraction. Karen's face drained of color. An infraction, she stammered. A fine of up to $500, the officer added. Plus, if you don't remove that chain immediately, we'll have it cut and removed at your expense. Karen gaped. This was not how things were supposed to go. Mark smiled. So, Karen, you going to move the chain, or should we let the city handle it? Karen's hands curled into fists at her sides. She had no choice. Grumbling under her breath, she unlocked the chain and yanked it off, throwing the cones onto her lawn. The officer jotted something down on her clipboard. You'll still be receiving a notice for the violation. I suggest you brush up on actual property laws before pulling something like this again. Karen seethed but said nothing. Mark? He just gave her a polite smile. Have a great day, Karen. As the officer drove off, Karen stomped back to her house, fuming. But Mark wasn't done yet. Because he had one more surprise up his sleeve, Karen stormed off toward her house, but Mark wasn't finished. He casually pulled out his phone again and made another call. Hey, Jim. Yeah, the issue's been taken care of, but I need you to move forward with a meeting. Let's handle it today. Karen froze on her front porch. She turned back, her face twisted in suspicion. What meeting? Mark grinned. Oh, just an emergency HOA board meeting. Karen's smug expression returned. Oh, Mark, please. You don't have the authority to call an emergency meeting. Only the HOA president can. She stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes widened. A horrible realization washed over her face. Mark chuckled. Oh, Karen, you didn't know. I'm the HOA president. Karen's jaw dropped. But I thought. You thought wrong, Mark said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. I was elected last year. Maybe you should have paid more attention instead of throwing fines at people over ridiculous rules. Karen sputtered, struggling to form a response. That's not possible. You don't even attend meetings. Mark tilted his head. Oh, I attend. I just don't waste my time on the petty nonsense you stir up. Karen looked like she was about to explode. Mark sighed dramatically. Anyway, I've already spoken with the board. We're having a vote tonight. You know, since you've been violating city codes and making unauthorized HOA decisions, we're considering removing you from the HOA entirely. Karen staggered back like she'd been slapped. You can't do that. Oh, we can, Mark said, grinning. And we will. Karen's face turned red as she clenched her fists. I'll fight this. I'll go to court. Oh, sure, Karen, Mark interrupted. You do that. But in the meantime, you might want to pack up your little rulebook. Because after tonight's meeting, you won't have any authority left in this neighborhood. Karen stood there speechless. Mark took one last sip of his coffee and turned toward his house, leaving her gasping in fury on her porch. By the end of the night, Karen would no longer be an HOA board member. And Mark? He was going to enjoy every second of it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Karen stormed into the HOA meeting, her face a mix of rage and desperation. The community center was packed. More homeowners had shown up than usual, all eager to witness what was about to unfold. Mark sat at the head of the table, calmly reviewing documents, while the other board members whispered amongst themselves. Karen slammed a stack of papers onto the table. This is ridiculous. I have served this HOA for years. I demand to know why I'm being treated like a criminal. Mark raised an eyebrow. Karen, you're not being treated like a criminal. But we do need to discuss your actions. One of the board members, Susan, cleared her throat. Karen, we've received numerous complaints about your behavior, excessive fines, and unauthorized enforcement of HOA rules. Karen laughed bitterly. Complaints? From who? These people. She gestured wildly at the audience. They just don't like following the rules. A murmur of disapproval spread through the crowd. Mark sighed. Karen, you blocked a homeowner's driveway over a $79 fine. That's not enforcing rules. That's harassment. Karen crossed her arms. I was within my rights. Another board member, Greg, shook his head. No, you weren't. We checked the bylaws. The fines you've been issuing, half of them aren't even valid. You've been making up rules. Karen's face turned ghostly pale. That's not true. Mark smirked. We have proof, Karen. Emails, reports, and even a few residents who've recorded your, let's say, interesting conversations. Karen's breath hitched. You can't fire me. Mark leaned back in his chair. Actually, we can. And we will. The vote is happening now. Karen looked around frantically, but her usual supporters were suspiciously quiet. Even the people who once backed her avoided eye contact. They all knew what was coming. One by one, the board members raised their hands. All in favor of removing Karen from the HOA board. Mark asked. A wave of hands shot up. Karen gasped. No. Mark looked around. And against. Silence. Karen staggered back, gripping the table for support. This isn't happening. This isn't happening. Mark smiled. It is, Karen. And just so you know, you're not just removed from the board. The HOA will also be investigating all the fines you issued. Karen froze. You can't do that. Actually, we can. And we will. As Karen stood there, trembling, Mark gathered his papers, stood up, and adjusted his suit. Meeting adjourned. And just like that, Karen's reign of terror was over. Karen stood frozen, her face pale as the reality of her downfall set in. The homeowners who once feared her now whispered and exchanged satisfied glances. She had bullied, fined, and manipulated the community for years, but now her reign was officially over. Mark turned to leave, but Karen wasn't ready to give up. This isn't over, she screamed, slamming her fists on the table. I'll sue every last one of you. You'll regret this. Mark turned back slowly, smirking. Karen, you might want to rethink that. Karen narrowed her eyes. Oh, and why is that? Mark pulled out another document and slid it across the table. Because while you were busy harassing homeowners, you neglected one important detail, your HOA fees. Karen snatched the paper, scanning it frantically. Her hand shook as she realized what it was, a foreclosure notice. You haven't paid your dues in over a year, Mark continued. And per HOA bylaws, unpaid fees over 6 months can result in foreclosure. Karen staggered back, gripping the table. No, this is a mistake. It's not. And since you love enforcing HOA rules so much, we figured you'd appreciate this one being enforced too. The crowd erupted into murmurs and smirks. Karen looked around, desperate for help. But even her old allies avoided her gaze. No one was coming to her defense. You can't do this, she hissed. This is illegal. Greg, the other board member, shrugged. Not at all. In fact, you personally approved this rule when you were in charge. The irony hit Karen like a brick wall. The very policies she had weaponized against others were now being used against her. Mark leaned in, his voice calm but firm. You have 30 days to pay or vacate the property. But considering how many people you fined into financial ruin, I wouldn't expect much sympathy. Karen's knees buckled, and she collapsed into a chair, speechless. Mark turned to the crowd. Meeting adjourned. And with that, the homeowners burst into quiet applause. As the room emptied, Karen sat there, staring at the notice in her trembling hands. She had spent years ruining others' lives, and now she had ruined her own. Karen sat there stunned, gripping the foreclosure notice like it was her last lifeline. She had ruled over this HOA like a dictator, wielding fines and penalties like weapons, but now the same system she abused had turned against her. She refused to accept it. With a deep breath, she stood up, gathering the last of her arrogance. This isn't over. I still have connections. You think you can just take my home? I'll get a lawyer in. Mark cut her off, smirking. Go ahead, Karen. But good luck finding one who'll take your case pro bono. Because with your history, I doubt you can afford legal fees. Karen's face twisted in frustration. Mark was right. Her excessive fines and legal battles had drained her savings over the years. She had always assumed she'd be untouchable, but now she was realizing that she had no allies left. Still, she wasn't ready to give up. Karen marched out of the meeting hall, gripping her phone. If she couldn't beat them legally, she would at least make their lives miserable. She opened her community Facebook page and furiously typed out a post. HOA president illegally takes my home. This is a travesty of justice. Everyone needs to know the truth. She hit post, expecting immediate outrage. But instead, the first comment she saw made her stomach drop. You mean the same HOA president you tried to fine into bankruptcy? Cry harder, Karen. Then another. Karma finally caught up, huh? And another. Maybe if you weren't such a tyrant, people would care. Comment after comment mocked her, laughed at her, or celebrated her downfall. Her face turned bright red. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She thought at least some people would come to her defense. But there was no sympathy, no support, just payback. Karen slammed her phone down in frustration. She felt trapped, cornered. But she wasn't done yet. She had one last trick up her sleeve. She'd go straight to the county office and challenge the foreclosure. But what she didn't realize was that Mark had already planned for that too. As Karen stormed out of her house, seething with rage, Mark leaned back in his chair, feeling a quiet satisfaction. He knew the wheels had already been set in motion, and Karen's next move wouldn't work. For weeks, he had been preparing for this. He had consulted with the county office, ensuring that every step was legal, airtight. He'd also quietly made sure the local media knew about her tactics, how Karen had manipulated the HOA to harass neighbors, how she'd used underhanded tactics to line her pockets. It was a calculated move to ensure that when Karen made her final play, she would be completely exposed. He'd even arranged for a press conference to coincide with her arrival at the county office. Mark knew Karen would show up with all the anger and arrogance that had gotten her through years of manipulation. He was certain she'd make a scene, maybe even try to blame everyone else. When Karen stormed into the county office, she was ready to fight tooth and nail. But as she stepped through the doors, the first thing she saw was a group of reporters with cameras flashing, capturing the moment she entered. She froze. The cold sweat started to form as she realized this was not a typical meeting. Mark walked in behind her, smiling with quiet confidence. Karen, I'd like you to meet the press. They've been following your every move for weeks now. Karen's eyes darted around as she saw reporters already assembling their questions, some of them holding public records showing her questionable actions as HOA president. Her heart sank. She had been blindsided. This isn't fair, Mark, she snapped, her voice shrill with panic. You can't do this. But Mark wasn't intimidated. He calmly looked at the reporters. Actually, Karen, I'm doing what's best for the community. This is all going to be on the record now. We'll see just how much you care about the truth. As the reporters closed in, the real story unfolded. Karen had been shrewd, but she'd also underestimated the quiet, relentless force of Mark's strategy. Every dirty detail about her reign as HOA president was laid bare for everyone to see. The lies, the manipulation, the greed. It was all there, and there was no way out. By the time Karen realized she was trapped, it was too late. The press conference turned into a media spectacle. Local residents, who had been under Karen's thumb for far too long, watched as the story of her fall from power was told. Mark had turned the tables so effectively that even her last-ditch efforts to salvage her reputation were completely dismantled. And as the press conference wrapped up, with Karen slipping out the back door, Mark knew one thing for sure. The community would never again be under her control. Karen's downfall had only just begun. While she tried to retreat into the shadows after the press conference, the consequences of her actions were only just unfolding. The community, once divided under her reign, began to rally together in solidarity. People who had felt isolated, intimidated, and voiceless under her authority now saw a glimmer of hope. They realized that with Karen out of the picture, real change was possible. As the weeks passed, Mark's influence grew even stronger. He had already begun improving the HOA policies. The new changes were focused on fairness, transparency, and respect for every homeowner. There was a noticeable shift in the neighborhood. People began to speak up more, attend HOA meetings, and voice their concerns without fear. Meanwhile, Karen was dealing with the fallout. Her former allies in the HOA board turned their backs on her, distancing themselves from the scandal. The county records now showed an undeniable pattern of corruption and illegal activities, which meant that she couldn't escape the public eye, no matter how much she tried. In the midst of all this, the most shocking blow came when Karen received a formal investigation from the local authorities for abuse of power. The press releases and media coverage about her actions had led to further scrutiny, and now Karen was not only facing the loss of her position but also the threat of legal consequences. Her once tight grip on power was slipping away fast. The humbling moment came one afternoon when Karen tried to make amends with a few of the residents she had wronged. She showed up at a community meeting, hoping to regain some favor, but was met with cold stares and accusations from all sides. Karen's voice, which once carried weight, was now drowned out by the collective defiance of the community. She tried to argue, but no one was listening. She quickly realized that the very people she had once controlled were now the ones in charge of their own futures. Mark watched from the back of the room, his face calm but with a small, almost imperceptible smile of satisfaction. He knew this was more than just a victory for him. It was a victory for the entire neighborhood. The old power dynamics were shattered. The community was taking back control of their lives. Karen's attempts to regain control continued to falter, and as her reputation continued to degrade, her financial situation worsened. With a legal investigation looming, it was only a matter of time before the consequences of her actions would land her in serious trouble. As Mark looked out over the crowd that day, he knew he had not only outsmarted Karen but also provided the community with an opportunity for true progress and prosperity. He had become a symbol of integrity, someone who fought for what was right. And most importantly, he had shown that sometimes justice doesn't come from power, but from the willingness to stand up against the wrongs around us. Karen's power had crumbled, and now she would have to face the harsh reality of her choices. The community had moved on, and Mark's leadership had set them on a path toward a brighter future. The neighborhood was healing, and Mark was proving that with honesty and perseverance, even the most entrenched problems could be solved. Karen's reign was over,